The year 1883 marked a pivotal moment in American history, particularly along the winding course of the Red River. This waterway, which serves as a natural boundary between Texas and Oklahoma, had long been more than just a geographical feature. It was a lifeline, a corridor of commerce, and increasingly, a contested frontier where ambitions collided and fortunes were made or lost. The Red River region in the early 1880s represented the quintessential American frontier experience. It was a place where established legal frameworks struggled to keep pace with rapid settlement, where land ownership remained contentious, and where the promise of prosperity drew people from all walks of life. Understanding the context of this region during this period is essential to comprehending the events that would unfold and the reasons why certain incidents came to be suppressed in official records. This chapter examines the Red River as it existed in 1883, its geography, its people, its economy, and the complex web of interests that made it both a land of opportunity and a place where conflicts simmered beneath the surface of everyday life. The Red River stretches approximately 1,360 miles from its headwaters in the Texas Panhandle to its confluence with the Mississippi River in Louisiana. In 1883, the portion of the river that would become central to our story ran through territory that was experiencing dramatic transformation. The river itself was unpredictable, prone to flooding in spring, reduced to a trickle in summer drought, and always carrying the distinctive red sediment that gave it its name. The strategic importance of the Red River cannot be overstated. It provided water for livestock and agriculture in an often arid landscape. It served as a transportation route, though navigation was challenging due to seasonal variations in water levels and the presence of sandbars and debris. Most critically, it functioned as a boundary line, and boundaries in the American West of the 1880s were frequently sources of legal ambiguity and territorial disputes. The lands adjacent to the Red River were diverse in character. Some areas featured fertile bottomlands suitable for agriculture, particularly cotton cultivation. Other sections consisted of rolling prairie grasslands, ideal for cattle ranching. The region also contained valuable timber resources, particularly along the river's eastern reaches. This variety of natural resources meant that multiple economic interests competed for control and access. By 1883, the Red River region was experiencing significant demographic change. The area was home to a diverse population that included long-established Native American communities, Anglo-American settlers who had arrived in waves since Texas independence, former soldiers from both sides of the Civil War seeking new beginnings, African Americans establishing communities in the post-Reconstruction era, and recent European immigrants drawn by the promise of available land. The settlement pattern was uneven and sometimes chaotic. Established towns and communities existed alongside newly formed settlements that might consist of little more than a few buildings. The lack of comprehensive surveying and the complexities of land titles meant that disputes over property boundaries were commonplace. Some settlers held legitimate deeds obtained through proper legal channels. Others claimed land through squatters' rights, having occupied and improved property without formal title. Still others held claims of dubious validity, sometimes obtained through questionable transactions or outright fraud. The Native American presence in the region requires particular attention. Various tribes, including the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and others, had historical connections to lands along the Red River. The federal government's policies regarding Native American territories had created a patchwork of reservations, ceded lands, and disputed territories. The exact status of certain parcels remained unclear, and this ambiguity created opportunities for manipulation by those willing to exploit legal uncertainties. African American communities had established themselves in various locations along the Red River following the end of the Civil War. Some were freedmen, who had remained in areas where they had previously been enslaved, while others had migrated seeking economic opportunities and the possibility of land ownership. These communities often faced significant obstacles in securing clear title to land and in having their property rights respected by local authorities. The economic landscape of the Red River region in 1883 was characterized by several competing and sometimes complementary interests. Understanding these economic forces is crucial to comprehending the tensions that would eventually culminate in the events this documentary explores. Cattle ranching. The cattle industry dominated much of the Red River country. The era of the great cattle drives was nearing its end, but ranching remained the primary economic activity across vast stretches of the region. Large ranchers controlled enormous tracts of land, not always with clear legal title. The open range system was giving way to fenced properties, creating conflicts between established ranchers and newcomers, between cattle operations and agricultural settlers, and between those who claimed traditional grazing rights and those who held formal ownership documents. The economics of ranching in this period were complicated. The previous decade had seen boom times, with cattle prices high and fortunes made seemingly overnight. By 1883, however, the industry was facing challenges. Overproduction had begun to depress prices. Harsh winters and drought conditions had taken their toll on herds. Some ranchers found themselves overextended financially, creating pressure to secure additional land or to generate revenue through other means. Agriculture. Cotton cultivation had expanded significantly in the Red River region during the 1870s and early 1880s. The rich bottomlands near the river were particularly suitable for cotton, and the crop represented a potential source of substantial profit. However, cotton farming required different land use patterns than ranching. It demanded clearly defined property boundaries, significant labor forces, and access to water for irrigation during dry periods. The expansion of cotton farming brought agricultural settlers into conflict with established ranching interests. Farmers sought to acquire and fence land that ranchers had long used for grazing. This fundamental conflict between different economic models and land use philosophies created considerable tension throughout the region. Timber. The eastern portions of the Red River region contained valuable timber resources. Hardwood forests provided materials for construction, fuel, and various commercial applications. Timber rights represented another layer of economic interest, and the ownership of timberlands was subject to the same ambiguities and disputes that affected agricultural and grazing lands. Timber companies, both local and from outside the region, sought to acquire or lease lands with valuable tree stands. The removal of timber had environmental consequences, affecting watersheds and changing the landscape in ways that impacted other economic activities. Conflicts arose over timber rights on lands where ownership was disputed, or where multiple parties claimed different types of usage rights to the same territory. Mineral rights. Although not yet fully recognized in 1883, the region held mineral resources that would later prove valuable. Even in the early 1880s, however, there was speculation about potential mineral deposits, and some land transactions included provisions regarding subsurface rights. This added yet another dimension to the already complex question of land ownership and control. The legal and governmental structures in the Red River region in 1883 were, to put it mildly, inadequate to the challenges of the time. Understanding these institutional weaknesses is essential to comprehending how certain events could occur and subsequently be suppressed or ignored by official authorities. Land title system. The system for establishing and recording land titles in the region was fragmented and often unreliable. Multiple sources of land grants existed: Spanish and Mexican grants from the pre-Texas independence era, Republic of Texas grants, State of Texas grants, and federal grants. These different systems did not always align, and the records were incomplete, poorly maintained, or in some cases deliberately obscured. County records, where they existed, were often kept in primitive conditions. Courthouses were sometimes little more than simple buildings lacking proper storage for important documents. Fires, whether accidental or intentional, had destroyed records in some locations. The officials responsible for maintaining these records were not always trained or competent, and the potential for corruption was significant. Law enforcement. The sheriff system in place during this period faced enormous challenges. Counties in the Red River region were often vast, with small populations spread across great distances. A sheriff and perhaps a few deputies were expected to maintain order, investigate incidents, and enforce laws across territories that might encompass hundreds of square miles. The sheriffs themselves were elected officials, which meant they were subject to political pressures and dependent on local power structures for their positions. Some sheriffs were dedicated and honest, attempting to fulfill their duties despite limited resources and difficult conditions. Others were less scrupulous, willing to overlook certain activities in exchange for political support or financial consideration. The absence of effective law enforcement in many areas meant that informal systems of justice often prevailed. Vigilante groups formed in some communities, claiming to provide security and order where official authorities were absent or ineffective. These groups operated outside legal frameworks and were not accountable to any formal oversight. While some vigilante organizations may have initially formed with legitimate intentions, they were susceptible to manipulation by those with particular agendas or interests to protect. Court system. The judicial system in the region faced similar challenges to law enforcement. Judges traveled circuits, visiting different communities on scheduled rotations. This meant that justice was neither swift nor always accessible. Cases might wait months for adjudication. Legal representation was available primarily to those who could afford to pay attorneys, giving wealthy interests a significant advantage in disputes. The Texas legal system in 1883 was still adapting to post-Civil War realities. Reconstruction had ended officially in 1877, but its effects continued to shape political and legal structures. Questions about the validity of certain laws, about voting rights, and about the authority of various governmental bodies remained subjects of contention. The social fabric of the Red River region in 1883 was complex and often strained. Multiple factors contributed to an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty. Post-Civil War divisions. Although nearly 2 decades had passed since the end of the Civil War, the conflict's legacy remained powerful. The Red River region included communities with strong Confederate sympathies alongside areas where Union loyalty had been maintained, or where newcomers from the North had settled. These divisions affected politics, business relationships, and social interactions. Former Confederate soldiers had returned to find their world transformed. Some adapted successfully to new economic realities. Others struggled with feelings of displacement and resentment. Former Union soldiers who had settled in the region sometimes faced hostility from established residents. These underlying tensions could surface in unexpected ways, affecting everything from business transactions to law enforcement. Racial dynamics. The racial climate of the Red River region in 1883 reflected the broader patterns of the post-Reconstruction South. The promise of equal rights that had briefly emerged during Reconstruction was being systematically undermined through both legal mechanisms and social pressure. African American communities faced significant obstacles. Voting rights, though theoretically protected, were increasingly restricted through various means, including poll taxes, literacy tests, and simple intimidation. Economic opportunities were limited, and attempts by African Americans to acquire and maintain property ownership often encountered resistance from white residents and officials. The relationship between white settlers and Native American communities was similarly complex and troubled. Federal policies aimed at opening Native American lands to white settlement created ongoing conflicts. Native Americans who attempted to maintain traditional lands or ways of life found themselves increasingly marginalized and facing pressure to relocate to designated reservation areas. Economic stratification. The economic gap between wealthy landowners and ranchers on one side and small farmers, laborers, and recently arrived settlers on the other created social divisions. A relatively small number of individuals and families controlled significant portions of the region's valuable land and resources. These established interests wielded considerable political power and were often able to influence local government and law enforcement to protect and advance their economic positions. Working people, cowboys, farmhands, laborers in various industries had limited economic security and little political power. Many lived at subsistence level, vulnerable to economic downturns, changes in employment opportunities, or conflicts with employers or landowners. Role of influential groups. Various organizations and informal networks wielded power in the Red River region. Some were legitimate business associations or civic organizations. Others operated in more shadowy fashions, advancing the interests of their members through means that might not withstand scrutiny. Cattlemen's associations, for instance, served as advocates for ranching interests. They lobbied for favorable legislation, attempted to regulate the industry, and sometimes took actions to protect what they perceived as their members' rights. Actions that might include confronting those they viewed as threats to ranching interests. Land companies, both legitimate and questionable, were active in the region. Some genuinely attempted to match settlers with available lands. Others were primarily vehicles for speculation or fraud. These companies sometimes employed agents who used aggressive or deceptive tactics to acquire land or to sell properties to unsuspecting buyers. Political factions competed for control of county and local governments. Elections could be contentious affairs, and allegations of fraud or intimidation were not uncommon. The control of local government meant control over law enforcement, over the court system, and over the land records, all positions of considerable power in a region where property rights were contested and valuable. Several factors converged to make the Red River region in 1883 particularly susceptible to serious conflicts over land and resources. Legal ambiguity. The unclear status of land titles created opportunities for those willing to exploit legal uncertainties. When multiple parties could claim legitimate-sounding rights to the same property, resolution often came down, not to the merits of the legal claims, but to who had more power, influence, or willingness to use pressure to prevail. This legal ambiguity was not accidental. Some benefited from maintaining confusion about land ownership. Clear, definitive records and titles would have limited opportunities for manipulation. The absence of such clarity created space for schemes that would not have been possible in a well-regulated system. Economic pressures. The economic climate of the early 1880s created pressures that encouraged aggressive competition for land and resources. Ranchers facing declining cattle prices sought to expand their holdings or to generate alternative revenue. Agricultural interests pushed for access to prime farming land. Speculators hoped to acquire properties that would increase in value as the region developed. These economic pressures meant that land was not just a place to live or work. It represented potential wealth, security, and power. The stakes were high enough that some individuals and groups were willing to employ questionable or outright improper methods to secure the lands they desired. Institutional weakness. The weaknesses of law enforcement, the court system, and local government meant that formal legal processes for resolving disputes were often ineffective. When people cannot rely on official institutions to protect their rights or to provide justice, they may turn to other means, or they may become victims of those more powerful or ruthless. The officials who were supposed to uphold law and order were themselves sometimes part of the problem. Sheriffs beholden to particular interests. Judges subject to political pressures. County officials willing to manipulate records. These corruptions of the system meant that justice was not equally available to all. Social divisions. The various social divisions in the region based on race, on Civil War allegiances, on economic class, on length of residence, meant that there was limited social cohesion or shared sense of community interest. When society is fragmented into competing groups with little trust or solidarity across group lines, it becomes easier for powerful interests to act with impunity. Those who might have been victims of schemes or improper actions often lacked the social capital or community support to effectively resist. Marginalized groups, whether defined by race, economic status, or other factors, found that their complaints were ignored or dismissed by authorities who did not view them as deserving of protection or consideration. Isolation and communication. The physical isolation of many communities in the Red River region meant that events in one area might not be known in others for days or weeks. This isolation made it possible for significant incidents to occur without immediate outside scrutiny. By the time information spread beyond the immediate locality, circumstances might have changed, evidence might have disappeared, or official narratives might have been established that obscured what had actually happened. The limited communication infrastructure also meant that it was difficult for dispersed individuals or small communities to organize collective responses to threats or injustices. Those who might have been natural allies in defending their rights were isolated from each other, making it easier to deal with them separately rather than facing unified resistance. Historians examining the Red River region in the period leading up to 1883 have often used the metaphor of a powder keg, a situation where numerous flammable elements are present, requiring only a spark to trigger a significant explosion. The flammable elements were present in abundance: disputed land titles, economic pressures, social divisions, weak institutions, and powerful interests willing to pursue their goals aggressively. What would serve as the spark that would ignite these accumulated tensions into a crisis remained to be seen. but the conditions were undeniably present for something significant to occur. Even before examining the specific events of 1883, it is instructive to note that patterns of suppressing or minimizing certain types of incidents were already established in the Red River region and similar frontier areas. Conflicts involving marginalized populations were often underreported or dismissed as insignificant by authorities. When the victims lacked social status or political power, their complaints might be recorded perfunctorily, if at all. Incidents that reflected poorly on local authorities or prominent citizens might be described in ways that minimized their seriousness or obscured key facts. The press of the era, such as it existed in the region, was limited in its coverage and often aligned with particular political or economic interests. Newspapers might fail to report certain incidents, or might present them in ways that supported particular narratives, while ignoring contradictory evidence. Official records, sheriff reports, court documents, land records, were the primary sources for future understanding of events. When these records were incomplete, inaccurate, or deliberately falsified, the historical record was correspondingly compromised. Future researchers would struggle to piece together what actually happened when the contemporary documentation was unreliable. The Red River region in 1883 was a place of contradictions and tensions. It offered genuine opportunities for those seeking land, economic advancement, and new beginnings. Simultaneously, it was a place where legal protections were weak, where powerful interests could operate with limited restraint, and where the most vulnerable members of society had little recourse when their rights were violated. Understanding this context is essential for comprehending the events that would unfold along the Red River in 1883. The incident that no sheriff dared to officially record did not occur in a vacuum. It emerged from a specific set of circumstances, from a social and economic environment where such an event was, if not inevitable, certainly possible. The various elements we have examined, the geography and strategic importance of the region, the diverse and sometimes conflicting population, the complex economic interests competing for land and resources, the weaknesses of legal and governmental institutions, and the social and political climate of the time, all contributed to creating conditions where a significant incident could occur and subsequently be suppressed or erased from official memory. As we prepare to examine the events of 1883 themselves, we carry forward this understanding of context. The people involved, both those who suffered and those who may have been responsible, were products of their time and place. The institutional failures that allowed events to be hidden were not accidental, but resulted from the specific characteristics of frontier society and governance in this period. The Red River of 1883 was more than just a geographical feature. It was a boundary between territories, a dividing line between different legal jurisdictions, a frontier where the promises of American expansion confronted the messy realities of human ambition, prejudice, and the struggle for power and resources. In the chapters that follow, we will examine what happened in this volatile environment, how it was hidden from the historical record, and how, many years later, the truth began to emerge. The story of the Red River in 1883 is not just about events in the past. It is about how history is recorded, who controls that record, and what happens when suppressed truths eventually come to light. The stage is set. The context is established. We now turn to the events themselves and to the long silence that followed, a silence that would not ultimately prove permanent. In the late spring of 1883, something happened along a remote stretch of the Red River that would become one of the most enigmatic incidents in the region's history. Unlike typical frontier conflicts that were documented, debated, and eventually incorporated into the historical narrative, this event was met with an unusual and telling silence. No official reports were filed by local law enforcement. No arrests were made. No inquests were held. The county records that should have contained documentation of the incident remained conspicuously blank. This absence of documentation is itself a form of evidence. Evidence that something significant occurred and that powerful forces worked to ensure it would not enter the official record. When historians and researchers later attempted to reconstruct what happened, they encountered not just a lack of information, but what appeared to be a deliberate effort to erase all traces of the event from public memory. This chapter examines what is known about the incident of 1883, the families and individuals affected, the mysterious gaps in official documentation, and the role that local authorities played in suppressing information. We approach this subject with appropriate caution, distinguishing between established facts, reasonable inferences based on available evidence, and matters that remain uncertain despite extensive research. Timeline: Spring 1883. Reconstructing a precise timeline of events has proven challenging due to the scarcity of contemporary documentation. However, through careful analysis of fragmentary sources, personal letters, diary entries, newspaper accounts from distant cities, and later testimony, researchers have established a general chronology. Early April 1883. Tensions in the Red River region intensified over a disputed tract of land located approximately 15 miles west of what was then a small settlement known as Riverside Landing. The land in question consisted of approximately 1,200 acres of prime bottomland adjacent to the river, suitable for both agriculture and cattle grazing. Multiple parties claimed ownership or rights to this property. A group of families, primarily consisting of recent settlers, held what they believed were legitimate deeds obtained through a land agent operating out of Jefferson, Texas. These families had been working the land for nearly 2 years, building modest homes, clearing fields, and planting crops. A prominent ranching interest in the region also claimed rights to the same land, asserting that the territory fell within the boundaries of a much larger grant that predated the settlers' deeds. This ranching operation was controlled by a syndicate of investors, some local, and others from as far away as St. Louis and Kansas City. A third claim to the land involved disputed rights related to an earlier Native American treaty. Representatives from the Choctaw Nation maintained that the land had not been properly ceded and that current occupation violated treaty obligations, though the federal government's position on this matter was unclear. Mid-April 1883, efforts to resolve the competing claims through legal channels proved unsuccessful. The county court, which would normally have jurisdiction over such disputes, appeared reluctant to take up the matter. The presiding judge postponed hearings multiple times, citing various procedural concerns and the need for additional documentation. During this period, representatives of the ranching syndicate made offers to purchase the settlers' improvements and to compensate them for leaving the disputed land. The amounts offered were, according to contemporary accounts, substantially below the value of the work the families had invested. The settlers declined these offers, insisting on their legal right to remain on land they believed they owned legitimately. Witnesses later reported increased activity around the disputed area during mid-April. Individuals identified as working for the ranching syndicate were observed surveying the property and meeting with various local officials. The settlers reported feeling increasingly concerned about their situation, and some wrote letters to family members elsewhere expressing worry about their security. Late April 1883. The situation deteriorated rapidly in the final week of April. Exactly what transpired remains one of the central mysteries of this case, as this is the period for which official documentation is most conspicuously absent. What can be established from later accounts is that a confrontation occurred between the settler families and a group of individuals whose exact identity and authorization remain disputed. The confrontation took place on or around April 24-25, 1883, though the precise date is uncertain. The immediate aftermath of this confrontation saw the settler families leave the disputed land. Some departed the region entirely, relocating to other parts of Texas or to neighboring states. Others moved to different areas within the county but maintained residence in the general region. Early May 1883. In the days and weeks following the confrontation, what is most notable is what did not happen. No official investigation was initiated. The local sheriff, a man named Clayton Murdoch, filed no reports regarding any incident in the area. The county court held no proceedings related to the disputed land or to the settlers' departure. The land itself was subsequently occupied by representatives of the ranching syndicate. Fences were erected, and the property was incorporated into the larger ranching operation. The homes and improvements built by the settler families were either dismantled or fell into disrepair. A small item appeared in a newspaper in Dallas several weeks later, noting briefly that a dispute over land near the Red River had been resolved, with the parties reaching an accommodation. No details were provided, and no names were mentioned. The families affected understanding who was involved in the incident is crucial to comprehending both what happened and why it was subsequently suppressed. Research has identified several families who were among the settlers on the disputed land, though the complete list remains uncertain. The Morrison family, Samuel Morrison, his wife Rebecca, and their 4 children had moved to the Red River area in 1881 from Arkansas. Samuel had served in the Union Army during the Civil War, a fact that may be significant given the social dynamics of the region. The Morrisons had invested their limited savings in acquiring what they believed was clear title to 160 acres of the disputed tract. Family letters written by Rebecca Morrison to her sister in Little Rock during early 1883 describe the family's hopes for their new farm and their concerns about the disputes over the land. Her final letter, dated April 18, 1883, mentioned that certain parties have been making threats and expressed worry about the family's situation. No further letters from Rebecca Morrison have been found in the family correspondence collection. The Morrison family left the Red River area sometime in late April or early May 1883. They subsequently appeared in records from Indian Territory, where Samuel Morrison found work as a freight wagon driver. The family never returned to Texas and, according to descendants, never spoke in detail about why they had left their land. The Williams family, Joseph and Martha Williams, an African-American couple, had established themselves on a portion of the disputed land in 1882. They had previously been sharecroppers, but had managed to save enough to make a down payment on what they believed was their own property. The Williams family faced additional challenges beyond the land dispute itself. As African-Americans attempting to establish independent land ownership, they encountered resistance from some elements of the white community. Their claim to the land was questioned on grounds beyond the title dispute, with some asserting that the original land agent should not have sold property to them. Records indicate that the Williams family relocated to a freedmen's community in northeastern Texas following the incident. Joseph Williams later filed an affidavit, preserved in county records from his new location, stating that he had been forced from land rightfully purchased and had lost all investment in said property. However, he provided no specific details about how or why this occurred. The Keller family, Heinrich and Greta Keller, were German immigrants who had arrived in Texas in the late 1870s. They had established a small farm on the disputed tract and were known for their industriousness and their efforts to remain neutral in local political disputes. The Kellers had 3 young children, and Greta was expecting a 4th child in the summer of 1883. Heinrich Keller had written to relatives in Germany describing the family's situation, and these letters, preserved in a German archive, provide some of the most detailed contemporary accounts of the land dispute and the tensions in the area. In his last letter from the Red River area, dated April 20, 1883, Heinrich described increasing pressure on the settler families and mentioned that men with firearms have been seen watching our properties. He expressed determination to defend his family's rights, but also acknowledged feeling vulnerable and uncertain about what might happen. The Keller family left the area shortly after the confrontation. They resettled near Fredericksburg in the Texas Hill Country, where Heinrich found work as a craftsman. In later years, when asked about their time near the Red River, family members reportedly said only that they had encountered difficulties and preferred not to discuss the matter. Other families. Research has identified at least 4 additional families who were resident on the disputed tract in early 1883 and who left the area during or immediately after the confrontation. These include the Patterson family, the Cruz family, Mexican-American settlers, the Johnson family, and the McBride family. Documentation about these families is even more fragmentary than for the Morrisons, Williams, and Kellers. What records exist indicate that they dispersed to various locations following the incident, with some leaving Texas entirely. None appear to have made formal complaints to authorities or to have pursued legal action related to their displacement from the land. The mysterious absence of official documentation. The gaps in the official record regarding the Red River incident of 1883 are not random or accidental. They display patterns that suggest deliberate suppression of information. Sheriff's records. Sheriff Clayton Murdoch held office in the county from 1881 to 1885. The sheriff's log and incident reports from his tenure are preserved in the county archives, with one notable exception. The period from April 15th through May 10th, 1883, is missing from the record. The log entries stop on April 14th and resume on May 11th. The missing pages represent approximately 4 weeks of documentation that would normally have recorded any significant incidents, complaints filed, arrests made, or investigations initiated. Given that this is precisely the period during which the confrontation occurred, the absence of these records is highly suspicious. When researchers inquired about these missing records, they discovered that no explanation exists in the official documentation. There is no notation indicating that pages were removed, no reference to lost or damaged records, no administrative note explaining the gap. The records simply skip from April 14th to May 11th, as if nothing noteworthy occurred during the intervening weeks. Further investigation revealed that other documentation from Sheriff Murdoch's office during this period is also absent. No expense reports for late April 1883 exist, which is unusual given that such reports were routinely filed for other months. No correspondence from the sheriff's office for this period has been preserved. Again, an anomaly given that correspondence exists for the months before and after. Court records. The county court records for 1883 show a similar pattern of absence. No cases were filed relating to the disputed land during the critical period, despite the fact that legal proceedings would have been the normal mechanism for resolving such disputes. More tellingly, a case that had been scheduled for hearing in late April, a suit brought by the settler families seeking to confirm their land titles, simply disappears from the docket. The case was listed on the court calendar for April 28th, but there is no record of the hearing taking place, no continuance notation, no dismissal order, and no judgment. The case file itself is missing from the court archives. When attorneys for the families later inquired about the status of the case, they received responses indicating that no such case could be located in the court records. It was as if the legal action had never been filed, despite the existence of earlier calendar entries proving that it had been. Land records. Perhaps most significantly, the land records for the disputed tract show irregularities that suggest deliberate manipulation. The deeds held by the settler families were recorded in the county land records in 1881 and 1882. These recordings can still be found in the deed books from those years. However, a notation appears in the index for these deeds, indicating they were voided by correction deed dated April 30th, 1883. The correction deed referenced in this notation does not exist in the county records. Despite the index entry indicating that such a document was filed, no deed with that date appears in the deed books. The absence of this supposedly controlling document makes it impossible to determine on what legal basis the original deeds were voided. Subsequently, a new deed was recorded in June 1883, granting clear title to the entire disputed tract to the ranching syndicate. This deed makes no reference to the previous deeds held by the settler families and contains no explanation of how the conflicting claims were resolved. The chain of title thus shows a suspicious gap. The settler families' deeds exist in the record but are marked as voided by a non-existent document, and then a new deed appears granting ownership to different parties with no explanation of the intervening steps. Correspondence and official communications. Normal governmental operations generate various forms of correspondence: letters between officials, reports to state authorities, requests for assistance or guidance, and routine administrative communications. For the period surrounding the Red River incident, such correspondence is notably absent. The county commissioner's court minutes make no reference to the land dispute or its resolution. Letters between the county judge and state officials show a gap for late April and early May, 1883. Even routine matters that would normally have generated some form of written communication appear to have produced no documentary record during this critical period. This absence of normal administrative documentation during a specific limited time period suggests a coordinated effort to avoid creating written records that might later prove problematic or that might contradict an official narrative of events. The role of local authorities. The suppression of information about the Red River incident required the cooperation, whether active or passive, of local officials who controlled the creation and maintenance of official records. Sheriff Clayton Murdoch, Sheriff Murdoch's role in the incident and its subsequent cover-up has been the subject of considerable research and debate. Murdoch was a local man, born in Texas, who had established himself as a successful rancher before being elected sheriff. He had connections to the prominent ranching interests in the county and had received financial support from these interests during his election campaign. Contemporary accounts describe Murdoch as an imposing figure, well-armed and commanding respect, or fear from the community. He was known to be efficient in dealing with certain types of lawlessness, particularly theft and disorder in the county's small towns. However, his relationship with powerful economic interests in the region created potential conflicts between his duty to enforce the law impartially and his obligations to those who had supported his election. In the immediate aftermath of the incident, witnesses reported that Sheriff Murdoch was conspicuously absent from the disputed land area. During a period when his presence would normally have been expected, given reports of tensions and potential conflict, the sheriff was documented as being in the county seat, some distance from the scene. Later, when questions were raised about the incident, Murdoch maintained that he had no knowledge of any significant occurrence requiring investigation. He stated that no complaints had been filed with his office and that he had no basis for initiating any inquiry. His position was that if the settler families had grievances, they should have brought them to his attention through proper channels. This response is problematic given evidence that some of the families did attempt to contact the sheriff's office during the period of heightened tensions. Letters from family members reference meetings with law enforcement and requests for protection. The absence of any documentation of these contacts in the sheriff's records suggests that such communications, if they occurred, were deliberately not recorded. County Judge Harrison Caldwell. Judge Caldwell presided over the county court that would have had jurisdiction over the land dispute. His role in the disappearance of court records and the vanishing of the lawsuit filed by the settler families raises serious questions about judicial independence and integrity. Caldwell had been appointed to the bench in 1882, following the death of his predecessor. His appointment was supported by the same political faction that controlled much of the county's government and that had close ties to major ranching and business interests. The judge's handling, or lack of handling, of the land dispute case indicates either incompetence or complicity in ensuring the case never received a fair hearing. The scheduled court date came and went without any proceeding taking place, and the case file subsequently disappeared. Judge Caldwell provided no explanation for what happened to the case, and there is no indication that he made any effort to locate the missing file or to determine why the hearing did not occur. In subsequent years, Judge Caldwell remained on the bench and was known for decisions that generally favored established economic interests over individual settlers or small landholders. His judicial legacy suggests a pattern of behavior consistent with the handling of the Red River incident. County Clerk and Land Recorder. The county clerk's office was responsible for maintaining land records, court filings, and various other official documentation. The clerk during the relevant period was a man named William Thatcher, who held the position from 1880 to 1888. Thatcher's role in the manipulation of land records and the disappearance of the correction deed that supposedly voided the settlers' titles is unclear. As the official responsible for maintaining these records, he either actively participated in their alteration or was negligent in allowing others to manipulate documents under his control. An examination of Thatcher's financial situation during and after 1883 reveals some interesting facts. Despite receiving only a modest salary as county clerk, Thatcher purchased a substantial property in the county seat in late 1884 and made improvements to his residence that would have been costly. While this does not constitute proof of improper payments, it does raise questions about the source of funds for these expenditures. Other officials. Various other local officials, county commissioners, the county attorney, tax assessors, would have had knowledge of the land dispute and the events of 1883. None left any record of concern or inquiry about what had occurred. This collective silence across multiple offices and positions suggests either a shared understanding that the matter was not to be officially acknowledged, or a climate of fear that discouraged officials from questioning the narrative of events promoted by powerful interests. Patterns of intimidation and silence. Beyond the manipulation of official records, there is evidence of efforts to discourage witnesses and affected parties from speaking about what had occurred. Several of the families who left the disputed land relocated to areas far from the Red River, sometimes to different states. While economic necessity may have played a role in these relocations, the distances involved and the apparent reluctance of family members to discuss their experiences suggest they may have felt unsafe remaining in the region. Interviews with descendants of the affected families, conducted by researchers many decades later, revealed a consistent pattern. The families who had been displaced from the Red River land had not spoken openly about their experiences, even to their own children and grandchildren. This silence, maintained across multiple families with no apparent coordination between them, suggests a shared trauma or fear that discouraged discussion of events. In some cases, family members reported that when the subject was raised, their ancestors would change the topic or would offer only vague explanations like, "We had trouble over land," or "It wasn't safe to stay." The specifics of what had happened, who was involved, and why they had not sought legal redress were not discussed. This pattern of silence extended to the broader community. The incident, despite apparently being significant enough to displace multiple families and to involve the suppression of official records, was not the subject of local discussion or folklore. It did not become part of the community's shared historical narrative in the way that other frontier incidents typically did. This absence from community memory is itself telling. Frontier communities typically preserved stories of conflicts, injustices, and dramatic events through oral tradition. The fact that the Red River incident did not become part of this tradition suggests active efforts to discourage such discussion or a collective understanding that the subject was not to be mentioned. The Ranching Syndicate, the entity that ultimately gained control of the disputed land, was a business organization known as the Red River Cattle Company. This syndicate had been formed in 1880 by a group of investors seeking to capitalize on the cattle industry's profitability. The principal investors in the company included several prominent regional businessmen, a banker from St. Louis, and representatives of an investment group based in Kansas City. The company controlled extensive lands in the Red River region and employed a significant workforce of cowboys, foremen, and managers. The company's operations were substantial and generally followed standard business practices for large ranching operations of the period. However, the company's acquisition of the disputed tract in 1883 stands out as unusual in several respects. Unlike the company's other land acquisitions, which were documented with extensive legal paperwork showing clear chains of title, the disputed tract appears in the company's holdings somewhat mysteriously. The deed recorded in June 1883 granting the land to the company provides little detail about the transaction, including no stated purchase price and no indication of who the sellers were. Company correspondence and business records from 1883, some of which were later obtained by researchers, make minimal reference to the acquisition of this particular property. For a tract of over 200 acres of prime land, this lack of documentation in the company's own records is curious. The managers and representatives of the Red River Cattle Company who were active in the region during the spring of 1883 included several individuals with questionable backgrounds. At least two had previous involvement in violent confrontations in other locations. Another had been investigated, though not charged, in connection with land fraud schemes in Kansas. The company's superintendent during this period was a man named Marcus Thornton, who had authority over the company's operations in the immediate region. Thornton had a reputation as an effective manager who was willing to take aggressive action to protect the company's interests. He had been involved in previous disputes with homesteaders who had settled on lands the company claimed. Records indicate that Thornton was present in the area of the disputed tract during late April 1883, and witnesses reported seeing him in conversation with Sheriff Murdoch and other local officials during the period leading up to the confrontation. The exact nature of these discussions was never documented. Reading the silences. When official records are absent or incomplete, historians must learn to read the silences, to understand what the gaps in documentation reveal about events and about the motivations of those who controlled the creation of records. The pattern of missing records surrounding the Red River incident of 1883 is too systematic and too specifically focused on a particular time period and subject matter to be coincidental. Sheriff's logs don't randomly lose 4 weeks of entries. Court cases don't simply vanish without any administrative notation. Land records don't routinely reference documents that don't exist. These absences point to deliberate suppression. Someone, or more likely multiple individuals in coordinated fashion, took steps to ensure that official documentation of the incident and its circumstances would not exist for future examination. This suppression required access to official records, authority to remove or alter documents, and confidence that such actions would not be questioned or investigated. These requirements point to involvement by officials themselves, or by individuals with sufficient power to compel officials' cooperation. The question of what exactly occurred. The most difficult historical question regarding the Red River incident is also the most fundamental. What exactly happened during the confrontation in late April 1883? The absence of contemporary documentation means that researchers must rely on fragmentary later testimony, on inferences drawn from circumstantial evidence, and on the patterns revealed by who left the area and under what circumstances. What can be stated with confidence is that multiple families were present on disputed land. A confrontation or series of confrontations occurred. The families left the land rapidly. No official investigation took place. The land was subsequently controlled by the ranching syndicate. The specific nature of the confrontation, whether it involved threats, actual conflict, legal process, or some combination, cannot be definitively established from available evidence. Different accounts from descendants of affected families suggest different experiences, which may indicate that the confrontation unfolded differently for different families, or that memories and oral traditions diverged over time. What seems clear is that the event was serious enough to cause multiple established families to abandon property they had invested in, to leave a region where they had been building lives, and to relocate considerable distances. People do not undertake such disruptions without significant cause. The role of legal ambiguity. The disputed nature of the land titles was central to enabling the incident and its suppression. Had the settlers' ownership been clearly established and universally recognized, displacing them would have required obviously improper action that could not easily be hidden. The existence of competing claims created ambiguity that could be exploited. Those seeking to gain control of the land could argue that they were simply pursuing their legitimate rights, that the settlers' titles were invalid, and that resolving the dispute in favor of the ranching syndicate was proper. This legal ambiguity also provided cover for officials who chose not to investigate or intervene. They could maintain that the matter was a civil dispute over property rights, rather than a situation requiring law enforcement action. They could assert that without clear evidence of criminal activity, they had no basis for involvement. The manipulation of land records served to retroactively create a documentary basis for the outcome, even though the actual process by which the dispute was resolved was not properly documented. The correction deed that supposedly voided the settlers' titles, despite not actually existing, served as a fig leaf of legal legitimacy. Power dynamics and institutional failure. The Red River incident exemplifies the power dynamics of the frontier and the failures of institutions that were supposed to protect individual rights and ensure justice. The affected families lacked the social, economic, and political power to effectively challenge the forces arrayed against them. They could not compel officials to investigate. They could not force the court system to hear their case. They could not prevent the manipulation of land records. When they sought protection for their rights, they found that the institutions that should have provided such protection were either ineffective or actively working against them. The ranching syndicate and its allies, by contrast, had resources, connections, and influence. They could shape official responses through relationships with local authorities. They could manipulate the legal system through financial and political power. They could act with relative impunity because they understood that local institutions would not seriously challenge their actions. This imbalance of power meant that the outcome of the dispute was likely determined not by the legal merits of competing claims, but by which party had the greater ability to impose its will and to shape the official narrative. The Red River incident of 1883 remains shrouded in uncertainty regarding its specific details, but its general contours are clear enough. Families who believed they had legitimate rights to land were displaced. Official authorities failed to protect those rights or to investigate what occurred. Records that should have documented the incident were suppressed or destroyed. and the land ultimately came under the control of powerful economic interests. What the official records won't say is, in many ways, as revealing as what they do say. The systematic nature of the documentation gaps, the coordination required to suppress information across multiple official channels, and the patterns of silence that descended over the incident all point to a deliberate effort to erase the event from historical memory. This effort at erasure was largely successful for many decades. The incident did not become part of standard historical accounts of the region. The families affected dispersed and did not speak openly about their experiences. The official records, to the extent they existed at all, provided no clear account of what had happened. Yet the erasure was not complete. Fragments of evidence survived, in personal letters, in family memories, in the gaps in official records themselves, and eventually in a journal that would come to light many years later. These fragments, when carefully assembled and analyzed, allow us to understand that something significant occurred, even if the full details remain elusive. The incident stands as a stark example of how history can be suppressed, how powerful interests can manipulate the systems meant to ensure justice, and how those without power can find themselves erased from the official record. It also demonstrates the resilience of historical truth, that even concerted efforts at suppression cannot permanently erase evidence of what occurred. As we move forward to examine the journal that would eventually bring this story back to light, we carry with us an understanding of what was hidden and why. The silence that surrounded the Red River incident for so long was not the silence of insignificance, but the silence of suppression. And as we will see, even such determined efforts to bury the truth cannot prevent it from eventually emerging. For more than 7 decades, the events along the Red River in 1883 remained buried beneath layers of official silence and fading memory. The families who had experienced the incident had dispersed, and their descendants knew only fragments of a story their ancestors had been reluctant to tell. The official records offered no assistance to anyone seeking to understand what had occurred. The land itself had changed hands multiple times, with each subsequent transaction further obscuring the controversial circumstances of the original acquisition by the ranching syndicate. Then, in 1957, a discovery in an unexpected location began to pull back the curtain on this long-hidden history. The discovery was not the result of a systematic historical investigation, but rather an accident, the kind of fortunate coincidence that sometimes reveals what deliberate searches cannot find. This chapter examines the remarkable story of how a personal journal, written by a witness to the events of 1883, came to light more than 70 years later. We explore what the journal reveals, how researchers worked to verify its contents, and how this single document transformed our understanding of an incident that powerful forces had worked so hard to erase from history. In the summer of 1957, a woman named Margaret Holloway was clearing out the attic of her deceased grandmother's home in Shreveport, Louisiana. The house, a modest Victorian structure that had been in the family for generations, was being prepared for sale. Margaret's grandmother, Elizabeth Chandler, had passed away at the age of 93, and the task of sorting through decades of accumulated possessions fell to her granddaughter. Margaret later described the attic as a repository of family history, trunks filled with old clothing, boxes of letters and photographs, furniture that had long ago been replaced, and various objects whose original purposes had been forgotten. Among these items was a metal document box, locked and showing signs of age and rust. The key to the box could not be located, and Margaret considered simply discarding it without opening it. However, curiosity prevailed, and she used tools to force the lock. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against moisture, was a leather-bound journal along with several loose papers and a small packet of letters tied with ribbon. The journal's first page bore an inscription, "Personal record of Reverend Thomas Ashford, commenced January 1880. Margaret recognized the name. Thomas Ashford had been her great-great-uncle, her grandmother's uncle, though she knew little about him beyond the fact that he had been a minister and had lived in Texas for a time. As Margaret paged through the journal, she encountered entries describing everyday life, observations about people and places, reflections on religious matters, and accounts of the author's activities and travels. Then she reached entries from April 1883 that were notably different in tone and content. These entries described events along the Red River in detail that was both specific and deeply troubling. Margaret recognized that the journal might be historically significant. She contacted a professor of history at a nearby university who examined the journal and immediately understood its potential importance. The professor, Dr. Harold Mitchell, specialized in Texas frontier history and was familiar with the general outlines of settlement along the Red River, though he had never encountered references to the incident described in Ashford's journal. Dr. Mitchell advised Margaret to have the journal professionally examined to establish its authenticity. He also suggested contacting archives and historical societies in Texas that might be interested in the document. This began a process of analysis and verification that would occupy researchers for several years. Who was Thomas Ashford? Understanding the credibility of the journal required understanding its author. Thomas Ashford was born in Virginia in 1842. He served as a chaplain with Union forces during the Civil War, an experience that shaped his perspectives and his later ministry. After the war, Ashford pursued religious work in various locations. He served congregations in Arkansas and Louisiana before moving to Texas in 1879. He was appointed as a circuit riding minister, responsible for serving multiple small communities scattered across a wide area of northeastern Texas, including settlements along the Red River. Circuit riding ministers in the frontier played unique roles in their communities. They traveled regularly between small settlements that could not support a permanent minister, conducting religious services, performing marriages and funerals, and often serving as sources of education and moral guidance. Their mobility and their position as trusted community members meant they often had knowledge of events and circumstances across a wide geographic area. Ashford's education was superior to that of many frontier residents. He had attended seminary and was literate, thoughtful, and committed to documenting his experiences and observations. His journal entries from the years before 1883 demonstrate careful attention to detail and a commitment to accuracy in recording what he witnessed. Importantly, Ashford's position gave him access to multiple communities and to people from different social and economic backgrounds. He ministered to wealthy ranchers and to poor settlers, to long-established residents and to newcomers, to people of different racial and ethnic backgrounds. This broad access meant he could observe events from multiple perspectives and could gather information from diverse sources. Research into Ashford's life confirmed several key facts. Church records documented his appointment and his service in the Red River region from 1879 to 1884. Contemporary letters from church officials referenced his work and character, describing him as conscientious and dedicated. Census records and other documents confirmed his presence in the region during the relevant period. Ashford left Texas in 1884, taking a position with a congregation in Louisiana. He continued his ministry there until his retirement in the early 1900s. He died in 1911 and was buried in Shreveport. His personal effects, including the journal, passed to his niece Elizabeth Chandler, Margaret Holloway's grandmother, who preserved them but apparently never examined them closely or shared their contents publicly. Contents of the journal. The journal spans several years, from 1880 through early 1884. Most entries are relatively brief, recording Ashford's travels, the services he conducted, people he met, and his personal reflections. The writing is clear and straightforward, without dramatic flourishes or elaborate language. The entries from April 1883 stand out immediately. They are longer than typical entries, more detailed, and written in a tone that conveys distress and moral concern. These entries describe Ashford's observations and experiences during the period of the Red River incident. Early April entries. Ashford's journal from early April 1883 describes the tense situation developing around the disputed land. He noted visiting families in the area and hearing their concerns about pressure from the ranching syndicate. He recorded conversations with settlers who expressed fear about their situation and uncertainty about whether legal processes would protect their rights. One entry from April 10th states, "Called upon the Morrison family at their homestead. Mr. Morrison spoke at length regarding the dispute over their land. He has deeds which he believes establish his ownership, yet representatives of the cattle company insist the land belongs to their operation. Mr. Morrison fears that legal remedies will prove ineffective, as the company has connections with local officials. He asked for my prayers for his family's safety and security." Similar entries document visits to other families in the area. Ashford noted the Williams family's particular vulnerability as African American landholders and the Keller family's sense of isolation as recent immigrants unfamiliar with American legal systems. He observed that the families were attempting to support one another, but felt increasingly pressured and threatened. Mid-April entries. The journal entries from mid-April describe escalating tensions. Ashford recorded that armed men, identified as working for the ranching company, had been seen near the disputed properties. He noted that some families had attempted to contact Sheriff Murdoch, but had received little assurance of protection. An entry from April 18th describes a meeting between some of the settler families and representatives of the ranching syndicate. According to Ashford's account, the company representatives offered to purchase the settlers' improvements for what Ashford characterized as amounts far below just value, and insisted the families leave the land. When the settlers refused, the company representatives reportedly stated that the matter would be resolved one way or another. Ashford's entry from this date concludes, "I am troubled by what I have witnessed. The families believe they have legitimate rights to their lands, yet they face opposition from forces far more powerful than themselves. The mechanisms of law and justice appear unavailable to them. I fear what may occur if this situation is not properly addressed by authorities." Late April entries. The critical period. The most significant entries are those from April 24-27, 1883. These entries provide the most detailed account available of what occurred during the confrontation. According to Ashford's journal, he was visiting the area on April 24th to conduct religious services for several families. He arrived to find the situation in crisis. A large group of men, which he estimated at between 15 and 20 individuals, had appeared near the settler properties. These men were armed and were led by individuals Ashford identified as Marcus Thornton, the ranching company superintendent, and several others whose names he recorded. Ashford's entry describes his attempts to mediate the situation. He approached the company representatives and urged them to withdraw and allow the legal system to resolve the land dispute. According to his account, Thornton informed him that the company had legal authority for its actions and that the settlers were trespassing on company property. The journal describes confrontations between the armed group and several of the settler families. Ashford writes that the company representatives issued ultimatums demanding the families leave immediately. When some settlers attempted to stand their ground, citing their deeds and their rights, tensions escalated dramatically. The entry from April 25th describes the outcome. The families have been forced from their lands. Some departed during the night, gathering what possessions they could carry. Others left this morning, their homes and fields abandoned. I witnessed Mrs. Morrison weeping as she carried her youngest child away from the home they had built. The Williams family departed before dawn, Mr. Williams saying he could not risk his family's safety by remaining. The Kellers loaded their wagon and left, Mr. Keller saying only that they had no choice but to go. Ashford's journal indicates he confronted Sheriff Murdoch about the situation. According to the entry from April 26th, I met with Sheriff Murdoch and insisted that he investigate what has occurred and provide protection to the families. The sheriff stated that he had no knowledge of any improper actions and suggested that the matter was a civil dispute that had been resolved. When I pressed him regarding the presence of armed men and the forcing of families from their properties, he became hostile and suggested that I should concern myself with religious matters and leave law enforcement to him. The final entry related to the incident, dated April 27th, conveys Ashford's sense of moral outrage and helplessness. I have witnessed an injustice that troubles my conscience deeply. Families who sought only to work land they believed was rightfully theirs have been driven away by force and threats. The authorities who should protect justice have instead enabled this wrong. I have documented these events as accurately as I am able, in the hope that someday the truth may be known and those responsible held accountable. I fear, however, that power and influence will ensure this matter is buried and forgotten. Additional documents. Along with the journal, the metal box contained several other items that provided supporting evidence and context. Letters from settlers. 3 letters written by members of the settler families to Reverend Ashford were preserved with the journal. These letters, written in the weeks before the confrontation, asked for the minister's prayers and counsel, They described the family's fears and their unsuccessful attempts to obtain protection from local authorities. One letter from Rebecca Morrison, dated April 15, 1883, states, "We do not know where to turn. The men from the cattle company watch our homes. They have told my husband that we will be forced to leave. When Samuel went to the sheriff, he was told there was nothing to be done unless we could prove the company's men had committed crimes. How can we prove threats that are spoken where no witnesses will come forward? We are afraid, Reverend, and we ask for your guidance and prayers." Ashford's correspondence. Several letters written by Ashford to church superiors in Louisiana and to other ministers were included in the collection. These letters, dated from May 1883, describe the incident and express Ashford's distress about what he had witnessed. In a letter to a bishop dated May 3, 1883, Ashford wrote, "I am compelled to report events I have witnessed that trouble me greatly. Families under my pastoral care have been forced from their lands through intimidation and threats. Local authorities have failed to intervene or investigate. I feel powerless to provide protection or justice to these people who have suffered such wrong." The bishop's reply, also preserved in the collection, acknowledged Ashford's report but cautioned against becoming involved in temporal disputes and suggested that the matter was beyond the church's authority to address. Newspaper clipping. A small clipping from a Dallas newspaper dated May 20, 1883, was tucked into the journal. The brief article mentioned that a dispute over land along the Red River has been resolved, with parties reaching an accommodation regarding the property in question. The clipping bears Ashford's handwritten notation. This account bears no resemblance to the truth of what occurred. Verification process. When the journal came to light in 1957, historians recognized both its potential significance and the need for rigorous verification. Claims about long-hidden historical incidents require careful examination to distinguish authentic documents from fabrications or misunderstandings. Dr. Mitchell and other researchers undertook a comprehensive verification process, physical analysis. Experts in document authentication examined the journal and associated papers. The paper, ink, and binding were analyzed to determine age and authenticity. The physical characteristics were consistent with materials from the 1880s. The aging patterns, the type of ink used, and the manufacturing marks on the paper all supported the conclusion that the documents dated from the claimed period. Handwriting analysis. Samples of Thomas Ashford's handwriting from other sources, church records, letters preserved in church archives, official documents he had signed, were compared with the journal entries. The handwriting analysis confirmed consistency, indicating the journal was indeed written by Ashford. Internal consistency. The journal entries from periods other than the April 1883 incident were examined for internal consistency and accuracy. Researchers found that Ashford's descriptions of places, events, and people could be verified through other historical sources. The weather conditions he mentioned matched historical weather records. The names of people he mentioned could be confirmed through census records and other documents. This pattern of verifiable accuracy in other entries supported the credibility of the April 1883 entries. Cross-referencing with known facts. The journal's account was compared with the fragmentary evidence that existed about the Red River incident. Ashford's descriptions of the families involved matched what researchers had previously learned from other sources. His timeline aligned with the period when records showed the families had left the area. His descriptions of local officials matched what was known about Sheriff Murdoch, Judge Caldwell, and others. Corroborating evidence. Researchers sought evidence that might corroborate Ashford's account. They found church records confirming his presence in the region during April 1883. They located correspondence from church officials that referenced Ashford's reports about troubles in his ministry area during this period. They discovered that some of the names Ashford mentioned in connection with the ranching company appeared in business records and other documents from the period. Most significantly, researchers located descendants of the affected families and shared Ashford's account with them. Several descendants reported that the journal's description aligned with fragmentary family stories they had heard, filling in details that had been lost over generations, but confirming the general outline that had been preserved in family memory. What the journal reveals. The journal provided several categories of information that had been absent from the historical record. Specific timeline. Ashford's daily entries allowed researchers to establish a precise timeline of events, something that had been impossible based on other sources. The sequence of increasing tensions, the confrontation itself, and the immediate aftermath could now be understood chronologically. Names and identities. The journal identified specific individuals involved in the incident, including Marcus Thornton and other representatives of the ranching company, as well as confirming the identities of affected families. These names provided starting points for additional research into the backgrounds and motivations of key actors. Nature of the confrontation. While maintaining appropriate reserve regarding specific details, Ashford's account clarified that the settler families had been forced from their land through intimidation and the presence of armed men. The confrontation was not a negotiated resolution or a legal proceeding, but an exercise of power against vulnerable people. Official complicity. The journal documented Ashford's direct interaction with Sheriff Murdoch and the sheriff's refusal to investigate or intervene. This provided evidence of official complicity in the incident and in its subsequent cover-up. Contemporaneous reaction. Unlike later reminiscences colored by time and distance, Ashford's journal captured immediate reactions to events as they unfolded. His moral outrage, his sense of helplessness, and his determination to document the truth provided insight into how the incident was perceived by at least one contemporary observer. Challenges and limitations. While the journal was a remarkable historical find, researchers recognized its limitations. Ashford was not present for every moment of the incident. His account is based on what he personally witnessed and what he was told by others. Some details came to him secondhand and could not be independently verified. The journal represents one perspective. Ashford was sympathetic to the settler families and critical of the ranching company and local officials. While his account appears accurate regarding facts he could observe directly, his interpretations and judgments reflect his particular viewpoint. Some names and details in the journal remain unclear or ambiguous. Ashford sometimes used initials rather than full names, or provided descriptions without identifying individuals specifically. This has limited researchers' ability to trace all participants in events. The journal does not provide a complete explanation of all aspects of the land dispute, the legal complexities of competing claims, the financial arrangements involved in the ranching company's operations, and the political dynamics among local officials are touched upon but not fully explained. Despite these limitations, the journal remains the single most important source for understanding the Red River incident of 1883, providing documentation where official records were deliberately suppressed. Why the journal survived. One of the striking aspects of this story is that the journal survived at all. Given the efforts to suppress other evidence of the incident, it might seem surprising that Ashford's detailed account escaped destruction. Several factors contributed to the journal's preservation. First, it was a personal document kept in private hands, rather than an official record that might have been subject to tampering. Second, Ashford left the region relatively soon after the incident, removing both himself and his documentation from the immediate reach of those who might have wished to suppress evidence. Third, the journal passed into his family's possession and remained there, unknown to historians or anyone who might have had interest in suppressing it. The journal's survival was ultimately a matter of chance. Margaret Holloway might easily have discarded the locked box without opening it, in which case this crucial evidence would have been lost forever. Impact on historical understanding. The journal's emergence transformed historical understanding of the Red River incident in several ways. Confirmation. It confirmed that a significant incident had indeed occurred, something that had been suspected based on gaps in records and fragmentary evidence, but not definitively established. Details. It provided specific details about what happened, who was involved, and how events unfolded, replacing speculation with documented information. Context. It placed the incident in broader context, showing how it emerged from tensions over land, involved failures by official authorities, and reflected power imbalances characteristic of the frontier era. Human dimension. Perhaps most importantly, it provided the human dimension, the experiences and perspectives of real people affected by historical forces. The families ceased to be abstract historical subjects and became real individuals, whose suffering and displacement could be understood and empathized with. Credibility assessment. Historians evaluating the journal have generally concluded that it is a credible source, while acknowledging appropriate caution about any single document. The verification process established that the journal is authentic. It was written by Thomas Ashford in the 1880s, not fabricated later. The question of accuracy is separate from authenticity, but several factors support the journal's reliability. Ashford had no apparent motive to fabricate or exaggerate. He was writing in a personal journal, not creating a document for public consumption or legal purposes. His entries about other matters are verifiable and accurate, suggesting he was a careful and truthful recorder of events. His account is consistent with other fragmentary evidence about the incident, and his perspective as a minister who valued truth-telling supports taking his testimony seriously. No evidence has emerged contradicting the journal's major claims. While details might be questioned or interpreted differently, the basic narrative Ashford presents has held up to scrutiny. The discovery of Thomas Ashford's journal in 1957 pulled back the curtain on events that had been hidden for more than 70 years. It provided documentation where official suppression had created only absence and silence. It gave voice to families whose experiences had been erased from the historical record. It named individuals whose actions had previously escaped accountability. The journal's emergence demonstrates a profound truth about historical evidence, that efforts at suppression, no matter how thorough, cannot guarantee permanent erasure. Documentation survives in unexpected places. Personal records escape the reach of those who control official archives. Truth has a persistence that outlasts attempts to bury it. For descendants of the affected families, the journal provided validation. The fragmentary stories their ancestors had told, the vague references to troubles along the Red River, the reluctance to discuss certain subjects, all of these now made sense in light of Ashford's detailed account. For historians, the journal opened new avenues of research and provided a foundation for understanding not just this specific incident, but the broader patterns of land disputes, official corruption, and power dynamics in the frontier era. The story of the journal's discovery also reminds us that history is not fixed or complete. New evidence can emerge decades or even centuries after events, requiring us to revise our understanding and to acknowledge that what we thought we knew was incomplete. The past, it turns out, is not entirely past. It continues to speak to us through documents that surface unexpectedly, through memories that are finally shared, through questions that prompt new investigations. As we move to the final chapter, we will explore how the journal's revelations have shaped subsequent efforts to document and commemorate the Red River incident, and what lessons this long-buried history offers about justice, memory, and the responsibility to uncover and acknowledge difficult truths. Chapter 4. Legacy and Historical Justice, Stories that Refuse to Stay Buried. The emergence of Thomas Ashford's journal in 1957 marked not an ending but a beginning, the start of efforts to fully document the Red River incident, to honor those affected, and to extract lessons from this suppressed history. Documentation efforts. Following the journal's discovery, historians initiated comprehensive research into the 1883 incident. Universities and historical societies in Texas established projects to locate additional evidence, interview descendants, and create a complete historical record. Researchers uncovered additional documentation, personal letters, land records showing the irregular transfers, and testimony from descendants whose families had preserved fragments of the story. By the 1970s, a substantial body of evidence had been assembled, confirming and expanding upon Ashford's account. Recognition and commemoration efforts to formally recognize the incident gained momentum in the 1980s. Descendants of the affected families organized to advocate for historical acknowledgement. In 1989, a historical marker was erected near the site of the disputed land, identifying what had occurred and honoring the families who had been displaced. Local historical societies developed educational materials, ensuring the incident would be taught as part of regional history. The story that had been deliberately erased was now being actively preserved and shared. Broader historical significance. The Red River incident proved significant beyond its specific circumstances. It became a case study in how frontier justice operated, how power shaped official records, and how marginalized groups were vulnerable to exploitation. Historians identified similar patterns in other locations and time periods: disputed lands, complicit officials, suppressed documentation. The Red River case provided a framework for understanding these broader phenomena. Analysis. The incident demonstrates how historical truth can be suppressed but not permanently erased. Official records can be manipulated, but personal documents, family memories, and persistent investigation can eventually reveal what occurred. The case also illustrates the importance of multiple perspectives in historical documentation. Ashford's journal survived precisely because it was a personal record outside official control, a reminder that diverse sources of evidence are essential to complete historical understanding. The Red River incident of 1883 was nearly lost to history. Powerful interests worked to erase all evidence of what had occurred. For decades they succeeded. But truth, as this story demonstrates, has remarkable persistence. The families forced from their lands in 1883 could not have imagined that more than a century later, their story would be known, their experiences documented, their suffering acknowledged. Yet through the preservation of a minister's journal, through the dedication of researchers, and through the advocacy of descendants, the silence was broken. This story matters not just as history but as a reminder. Injustices hidden today may yet be revealed tomorrow. Those who suppress truth may believe they have succeeded, but history teaches us otherwise. Some stories refuse to stay buried, and the truth, however long delayed, eventually emerges into light. The Red River incident stands as testament to the importance of documentation, the persistence of memory, and the possibility, even across generations, of historical justice.